You probably expect death to be quiet, but in medieval Europe, the moment you exhaled your final breath, people claimed they heard it, leaving an audible flutter, a gasp, or a whisper through clenched teeth. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight you'll follow your corpse on its last earthly journey, step by curious step, through a world where the dead were anything but silent. There's a hush around the cottage. Not grief exactly, more like waiting. The hearth is still warm, but someone has just passed. Villagers gather at the threshold. Some stare at the floor. Others look up nervously. Why? Because of the soul. They say it doesn't always depart immediately. Sometimes it lingers. A cow lowing in the distance. The faint scent of rosemary bundled near the head. And then it happens. A shudder, a final exhale. Someone whispers, "There it goes." But where did it go, and why did they think they could hear it? If you're still awake, maybe give that like button a gentle nudge. Subscribing won't stop time, but it might slow it just enough for us to explore it together. And if you're watching this from a creaky old farmhouse, tell me, what century does it feel like in your living room? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying flat on a rush-stuffed mattress, but you're not really there anymore. The air is heavy with oil lamp smoke and something sweeter, myrrh maybe, or crushed lavender. Above you, a taper flickers. Around you, murmured prayers. Someone ties a cloth around your jaw to keep it shut. But first, that last breath. Medieval people believed it held spiritual weight, sometimes literally. Witnesses claimed they saw mist escaping from the mouth or heard wings flutter. It wasn't just poetic imagination. It was the soul ascending if you were lucky, escaping devils if you weren't. In Cornwall, some villagers placed bowls of salt on the chest, claiming it helped weigh down the spirit, kept it from wandering. Others opened windows the moment death came, so the soul wouldn't get trapped indoors. To you, this might seem symbolic. To them, it was urgent engineering. One breath too slow, and your soul might miss its exit. Some monks taught that the soul lingered exactly 3 days. Others said it left immediately, but devils hovered nearby, trying to snatch it mid-flight. That's why your friends rush to ring bells, anoint your head, or whisper sacred names near your ears. Not to comfort you, to ward them off. Curiously, in German folklore, it was believed the soul made a sound like a tiny bell when departing. In some villages, death watchers would sit silently just to hear it. One woman from the Alps reportedly claimed she heard her mother's soul singing as it left like birds at dawn. Modern scholars suggest these stories might stem from gas escaping the lungs, but others think it reveals a deeper cultural fear the soul might forget the way. So here you are, still warm, but officially gone. Outside, someone tolls a single slow bell. Not for the living, not for the priest, but for you, so you can find your way wherever it is you're going. The candle gutters low, casting long, trembling shadows over the bed frame. Footsteps echo in the hall, soft, deliberate. And then the door creaks open. It's not the priest, not your kin. It's the women, sleeves rolled, buckets in hand, and their task is ancient. They have come to wash you. You wouldn't have much say in this. Few did. Once the soul was gone, or at least assumed to be, you were no longer a person, but a vessel, and vessels needed scrubbing. In most medieval villages, it was a small, tight-knit group of older women who performed this rite. They weren't necessarily midwives or healers, though some were. Their qualifications were quiet hands, steady nerves, and an understanding of what came next. They begin with warm water cloths, soaked in rosemary hyssop, or wormwood herbs believed to purify. They wipe your brow, your chest, your limbs. They hum as they work, not hymns exactly, but murmured syllables, rhythmic like prayer, but less formal. Your body is turned, lifted, padded, dry. This wasn't just about hygiene. Medieval thinkers believed the body and soul remained mysteriously connected for a short time after death. Washing you was an act of spiritual midwifery, cleaning not only flesh, but final traces of sin, fear, or confusion that might cling to the skin. Some said demons loathed clean corpses and preferred the scent of decay. One peculiar detail in some regions: mirrors were covered during this ritual so your spirit wouldn't get trapped or confused. In others, the women might open a door or unshutter a window before they began, as if to say, "You're free now. Go." The ritual wasn't universal. In colder climates where water froze easily, dry cloth or even snow might be used instead. In wealthier households, the process could be theatrical attendants in silk gloves, incense wafting from silver censers. But in most places it was humble. Buckets of rainwater, linen towels that smelled of smoke, hands cracked from winter. Some scholars argue this ritual reinforced women's roles as custodians of both birth and death. Others suggest it offered them a rare kind of power, the final say in how someone left this world. Still, others point out it was unpaid, unrecognized labor care disguised as duty. Once you're washed, the body is dressed. But not yet wrapped, that's still to come. First, your hair is combed, your hands are folded, your eyes, if still open, are closed. A penny might be placed under your tongue or over each lid. In pagan-rooted traditions, this paid your passage to the next world. In Christian lore, it simply kept your lids from fluttering open again, because that terrified people. And when they finish, the women don't linger. They pack up the bowls, wipe their hands, and nod to one another. One might whisper something like, "He's ready now," though no one says for what. And then they slip away, leaving behind a quiet room, a cooling body, and the faintest trace of rosemary in the air. The linen is coarse against your skin, rough spun, stiff, and unbleached. Someone draws it tight around your chest, your arms, your feet. Not tight enough to hurt, of course you can't feel pain anymore, but snug, like you're being packed for a journey, which in their minds you are. Wrapping the dead in linen was standard across much of medieval Europe. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even necessarily symbolic. It was just necessary. The body was vulnerable now, prone to swelling, leaking, twitching. Shrouds offered modesty, containment, and to many spiritual safety. Yet in some villages, the wrapping took on ritual weight. Knots were tied at the wrists, ankles, and sometimes at the throat, not to bind but to protect. Stories told of restless souls whose linen ties had come undone, causing them to wander. Others claimed that triple-knotted cords could confuse demons who apparently were very bad at untying things. The most curious of these knots, a 7-loop twist said to echo the days of creation. It was usually placed near the heart. In France's Auvergne region, local widows were often the ones entrusted with making it pass down like a secret spell. Of course, modern historians remain skeptical. Few written records survive, and much of this lore was oral, whispered between generations. As you lie there, linen-bound, someone might tuck a sprig of thyme into your folds, or stitch a small charm into the hem, nothing flashy, just a bit of blue thread or a cross of ash. These weren't superstitions, they'd insist, just traditions. Little habits that made the unknown seem slightly less dark. Scholars continue to debate whether these practices were primarily spiritual, hygienic, or psychological. Perhaps all three. Medieval people lived with death, constantly plagues childbirth, famine, accidents. Rituals like these gave them a fragile sense of control, a belief that if the knots were firm, the path ahead might be straighter. And here's a detail you wouldn't expect. Sometimes the wrapping wasn't complete. A hand might be left exposed so mourners could touch it, or a bit of face left visible through a fold. It depended on local custom or on the temperament of whoever was doing the wrapping. Not everyone wanted to be completely hidden. When all was done, the shroud was pinned shut with thorns, wooden pegs, or waxed twine. In some cases, it was sewn like a sleeping bag, and just before the body was moved, a final line might be whispered, May you sleep well or safe passage, brother. Nothing dramatic, no fanfare. Just a soft send-off, barely more than breath. And so you lie, shrouded, sealed still. Outside the air is cooling. A bell will toll soon. The grave is being dug. But for now, you are wrapped in linen, bound not with fear, but with care. A bundle of memories and mystery waiting quietly for whatever comes next. There it is. The bell. Not the loud pealing kind for feasts or warnings. This one is slow, deliberate, and distant. One ring, then silence. Another, then stillness. They call it the passing bell. And it isn't for the living. It's for you. In medieval belief, sound mattered. It carried weight. It could summon, repel, or guide. So when someone was dying or had just died, the church bell was rung not as an announcement, but as an act of spiritual defense. It said, "A soul is on the move. Let it pass safely. And if you're a devil, stay back." These bells weren't rung just once. There was often a pattern. 1 toll for a child, 2 for a woman, 3 for a man. Then a long pause. Then a series of 9 slow strikes called the soul peal. In some parishes, the order varied. What didn't change was the silence between each ring, space to listen, space to pray, or just space to wonder where exactly was. That soul-headed clergy believed the sound pierced not only the earthly realm, but the spiritual veil. Demons were thought to flee at the sound of consecrated metal. Angels, meanwhile, might follow the echo like a breadcrumb trail descending to escort the departed. It's poetic, of course, but to medieval minds, it was physics. Curiously, not every village agreed on when to ring the bell. Some insisted it be done while the person was dying to strengthen their soul's resolve. Others waited until the last breath, believing it helped guide the spirit in its first moments of disorientation. Still others rang it much later, when the body was carried from the house or lowered into the earth. In one English parish, records mention a bell caller whose sole job was to run from house to tower, alerting the sexton. Another account from Bavaria speaks of a boy who rang the bell too soon and was later haunted by dreams of the angry dead. Scholars question the veracity, of course, but still the story lingered. The phrase "for whom the bell tolls" comes from this very practice. It was a reminder not of death in general, but of someone specific. Someone just like you. And if you were lucky, the bell was rung long enough for your neighbors to pause, murmur a prayer, and remember your name. Some towns had multiple bells, a small one for children, a cracked one for those who died suddenly, and a heavy resonant one for elders. A curious aside, some people actually left money in their wills to ensure a specific bell would toll for them. Imagine being remembered not by words, but by tone. As the sound fades, there's a hush. Not empty, but full, like the air is waiting. The grave is ready. Your shroud is set. And somewhere between the ringing and the silence, your soul, wherever it is, has moved one step further along the path. A shadow moves across the threshold. He's not a priest, not kin, not even a friend. He's paid to be here for something unsettling. They call him the Sin Eater, and tonight he's come to dine on your soul. You lie still wrapped and bound while the villagers gather at a respectful distance. Not out of reverence exactly, but caution. Sin-eating was a ritual both feared and needed a peculiar fusion of folk belief and theological desperation. The idea was simple. Someone could absorb your unconfessed sins by consuming food placed on your corpse. A crust of bread, a mug of ale, sometimes cheese. The offerings were laid across your chest or beside your head. The sin-eater would step forward, often hooded or veiled, mutter a few lines, rarely biblical, mostly murmured vernacular, and eat. That was it. And yet everyone watching believed a spiritual transaction had just occurred. Not sanctioned by the church, of course. Clergy condemned it as superstition, But in poorer communities, especially in the borderlands of Wales and England, it persisted for centuries. People feared that without this rite, the deceased might wander in purgatory, restless and incomplete. With it, the soul might be lighter, cleaner. Who were these sin-eaters rarely named? Often outcasts, unmarried, poor, and already touched by some social stain. Once someone had eaten sins, it was believed they carried them permanently. Hence the avoidance. Villagers might cross themselves when passing a known sin-eater. Never invite one to dinner. Never shake their hand. There's a curious Welsh tale of a sin-eater who collapsed suddenly choking mid-bite and was buried in a ditch. No rites, no bell, no linen shroud. He had eaten too many sins, they said, and the weight pulled him down. Modern historians remain skeptical, citing folklore exaggeration. But even they admit the practice existed longer than expected, some reports as late as the 19th century. And yet, not all sin-eaters were grim. In a few scattered regions, they were even offered warm cloaks or coins after the meal. Not because people admired them, but because they'd done what others couldn't. They'd cleaned what prayer alone might not have reached. There's something oddly tender in that. Here at the edge of theology and fear, a stranger bends to take your spiritual leftovers. They chew silently, swallow, wipe their mouth. And in that moment, your burden is lifted, or so they believe. As the ceremony ends, the food scraps are burned or buried. The sin-eater departs quickly, avoiding eye contact. Children are told not to follow. You meanwhile lie untouched. You've been eaten for in a way. And whatever sins you forgot or refused to confess, they now belong to someone else. The wind picks up slightly. The bell has fallen quiet. Soon the procession will begin. But before that, a moment of stillness. Your soul perhaps is lighter now. Or at least someone has taken on its weight. You feel movement now, not your own, of course, but the jostling of hands beneath your shroud. They're lifting you carefully, slowly. Someone grunts. Someone whispers, "Mind the head." Outside, the earth smells damp. And you're on your way to the grave. But are you in a coffin that depends? Coffins weren't guaranteed in the medieval world. In fact, for most people, they were a luxury. Wood was expensive, labor-intensive, and needed for more practical things like tools, fences, or firewood. So, unless you were wealthy, noble, or particularly revered, your final bed was the earth itself. Still, wooden coffins did exist. Simple boxes often hastily made with no handles and rough nails. Some were reused. Yes, reused. A body might be carried to the grave in a coffin, then slipped out and buried directly in the dirt, with the box returned for the next soul in line. Pragmatic. Yes. Comforting, debatable. Certain tradesmen specialized in these temporary coffins. They built them wide at the shoulders, tapering down toward the feet. Often they bore no decoration at all, unless the deceased was someone of note. Then perhaps a carved cross, a name, or oddly a depiction of the tools they used in life. One blacksmith was buried in a box etched with tongs and horseshoes. In coastal areas where wood was scarcer, people sometimes used wicker-plated reed coffins that dissolved quickly in the soil. There are even accounts of hollowed-out logs being used especially in forested regions. Some historians think this was symbolic, returning to nature inside nature. Others think it was just what they had. And what about those without coffins at all? Wrapped in their linen, they were often laid in shallow graves padded with straw or moss. One curious account from rural Ireland describes people placing flat stones under the head and feet, as if to balance the soul on its journey. Grave goods were rare by this period, discouraged by the church. But occasionally someone might be buried with a wooden spoon, a small cross, or a lock of hair tied in cloth. Nothing showy, just tokens, reminders. In a few places a pebble from the family hearth was tucked into the shroud so the deceased could carry home with them. Of course, the decision to use a coffin or not wasn't just economic. It could also reflect belief. Some felt the body should return directly to the soil to decay naturally and rise again unencumbered on Judgment Day. Others thought a box offered dignity protection from animals or simply a more structured farewell. And so, your bearers pause. They lower you slowly, carefully. Perhaps the wooden box creaks. Perhaps there is no box at all, just cloth dirt and the steady thud of shovels. Above, someone murmurs a prayer. Below, the soil waits dark cold and utterly patient. One way or another, you've reached the brink. Not the end, they'd say. Just the beginning of a quieter chapter. The ground is closed now. The mourners have drifted off. But not all corpses are equal, and not all graves are sweet-smelling. In medieval Europe, a peculiar belief lingers in the damp air some bodies rot, while others seem to radiate perfume. And if yours smells like roses, you might just be a saint. They call it the odor of sanctity. The idea that especially holy people, monks, nuns, martyrs, don't decompose the same way ordinary sinners do. Instead of the sharp tang of decay, their corpses were said to emit the scent of flowers, incense, or honey. The implication, purity lingered even in death. Accounts vary. One nun's body was exhumed after 15 years and found fresh as wax with a scent like violets. Another, a hermit buried near a stream, supposedly made the whole hillside smell like frankincense. Of course there's debate. Modern scholars suggest embalming oils, resin-soaked garments, or cool burial conditions might explain the aromas. But that's not what medieval people believed. In some cases, word of a fragrant corpse spread fast, and the body was dug up, paraded, and tested by clergy for signs of sainthood. Skin color, muscle pliancy, and of course, smell. There's a curious record of a bishop sniffing a preserved thumb and declaring rosewater, and righteousness. A bit theatrical, perhaps. But in a time before canonization required formal paperwork, scent was as good as a signature. But here's the awkward flip side. Most corpses didn't smell like anything pleasant. In fact, some were so foul that gravediggers worked with herbs stuffed in their collars or chewed on cloves to mask the stench. You wrapped in your shroud and tucked beneath the soil are hopefully spared from the olfactory critiques of the living. What determined the difference, some said it was virtue. Others whispered it had to do with how you died, peacefully versus violently. Still others blamed the soil, the season, or the grace of God. One monk theorized that martyrs burned alive gave off no smell at all because fire purifies instantly. That same monk interestingly died of food poisoning and was said to have reeked of fish. There are also reports of bodies that began to smell sweet after burial, especially when relics were collected. Fingers, toe, bones, strips of cloth, all imbued supposedly with the fragrance of holiness. A few pilgrims even claimed to fall into trances simply by inhaling near a saint's resting place. Placebo devotion, or just very strong herbs, historians remain divided. Some see these tales as poetic embellishment. Others point to the symbolic importance of scent in a world with few clean spaces, where fragrance was a sign of divine order amid daily squalor. What's certain is this people sniff their dead more than you'd expect. And your scent is not recorded. Maybe you smelled of nothing. Maybe the rosemary held. Or maybe someone passing your grave paused, took a breath, and wondered, was that lavender? The clink of spades fades into the distance. Dusk settles over the churchyard, but behind the chapel, tools are still moving, not in prayer, but labor. Meet the gravediggers, the unsung, often underpaid custodians of medieval burial. They know every inch of this earth, and more than a few secrets buried beneath it. Digging graves wasn't just manual labor, it was a career, one with strange rhythms and stranger perks. The local sexton, usually in charge of church grounds, often employed assistants for the grimmer tasks. Pay varied wildly. In richer parishes, it could be a steady living. Elsewhere, you might be paid in food, firewood, or the occasional salvage boot from a corpse. Digging wasn't as simple as shoveling a hole. Gravediggers needed to navigate packed earth, avoid earlier burials, and work quickly to meet spiritual timelines. It was believed the soul lingered for up to 3 days. Burial delays risked unrest, spiritual and physical. A standard grave had to be deep enough to deter scavengers and suppress smell. The oft-quoted 6 feet under wasn't universal, but became a loose guideline, especially during plagues. One English town ordinance from the 14th century specified no less than 5 foot, nor more than 7. It may sound bureaucratic, but it reflected real fears of disease and resurrection gone wrong. Gravediggers had tricks. One method involved stabbing the soil with iron rods to test for empty pocket signs of previous forgotten burials. They also recognized bad soil by color or smelled damp clay that slowed decomposition or sandy patches where bones shifted oddly. One gravedigger reportedly used garlic to keep spirits at bay. Another carried a pebble from a saint's shrine in his boot just in case. And then there were the night jobs. In some regions, gravediggers moonlighted as resurrection men, paid to quietly exhume bodies for physicians, relic seekers, or even rival churches wanting a miraculous corpse. It was dangerous work. Get caught and you faced fines, flogging, or worse. Get away with it, and you might just earn enough to buy real shoes. Curiously, the role came with a peculiar kind of status. Children feared them. Priests tolerated them. Widows often offered thanks quietly. They were seen as both profane and essential, the bridge between dust and devotion. In a way, they understood mortality more intimately than the theologians. Some became folklore figures themselves. A gravedigger in Bavaria was said to whistle to keep ghosts away, never the same tune twice. Another in northern France spoke only at funerals and was believed to sleep in a crypt. Are these tales exaggerated? Probably. But like the corpses they buried, the truth lies somewhere underground. And so while you rest beneath the soil, these men dig nearby. Sleeves rolled, backs bent. Humming, perhaps. Their tools clink against old stones, past bones, forgotten trinkets. They won't remember your name, but they'll remember your grave, its shape, its soil, its secrets. A quiet row of mounds stretches across the field, all pointed in the same direction. Your grave is no different. It faces east deliberately, precisely like all the others, not for symmetry, not for sunrises, but for something much louder. Trumpets, you're being positioned for resurrection. In medieval Christian belief, Judgment Day was not metaphorical. It was a literal bodily event. At the end of time, souls would return to their earthly remains, rise from their graves, and be judged. And according to Scripture, this would begin in the east with the return of Christ descending from the direction of Eden. So, to prepare for that cosmic moment, your body was placed facing east. So you'd rise looking toward the light, the trumpet call, and your potential salvation. Imagine thousands of corpses all waking at once, all looking the same way. Coordinated, reverent, slightly eerie. The orientation applied to nearly everyone except priests. Curiously, clergy were often buried facing west. Why? Because they were meant to rise facing their congregation, ready to lead once again, even in death. Scholars still debate whether this was universally applied, or only practiced in certain orders. Burial records suggest inconsistencies, but the symbolism was clear. Spiritual roles didn't retire. This eastward custom also impacted church design. Cemeteries were planned so graves wouldn't be obstructed. Churches themselves were oriented with the altar to the east and the entrance to the west, echoing the journey from life to death, and possibly back again. But there were complications. What if land sloped the wrong way? What if the town ran out of space in some cramped graveyards, bodies were stacked or angled awkwardly, still roughly east-facing, but with elbows touching elbows? And yet, even in crowded plots, caretakers tried to maintain this sacred geography. A curious side effect of this uniformity identity sometimes got lost. With all heads pointed east and shrouds identical, only the placement and memory distinguished one grave from another. Wooden markers decayed. Stone was expensive. It wasn't unusual for a grave to vanish from memory within a generation. But the belief held strong. No matter your status in life, in death, you joined the same waiting room. Whether you were a baker, a knight, a leper, or a midwife, you lay in line facing the same dawn. There's even a folk tale from Denmark about a lazy nobleman buried westward by mistake. When the trumpet sounded, he supposedly rose facing away and wandered for hours looking for the judgment. It's said his ghost still walks eternally lost. A cautionary tale, perhaps. Or just a reminder to check your compass. And you, your grave is aligned, your shroud still intact, your body at rest. The trumpet hasn't sounded yet, but if it ever does, you're pointed in the right direction. Eyes closed, feet west, chin tilted slightly toward eternity. Rain taps gently on the chapel roof. Inside, a monk scribbles names into a ledger, pausing now and then to warm his ink-stained fingers. It's not just a record, it's a contract. Prayers bought and sold. Welcome to the medieval insurance plan for your afterlife purgatory fire coverage. You lying beneath the earth might be done with this world, but your soul isn't quite finished. According to medieval doctrine, most souls didn't leap straight to heaven. They lingered in purgatory undergoing purification, an uncomfortable, sometimes fiery process. But there was a solution prayer, specifically paid prayer. Wealthy families often left money in their wills to hire priests or monks to say masses on their behalf after death. The idea was simple: the more prayers said in your name, the faster your soul could burn off its sins and ascend. Think of it as a cosmic fast pass purchased by coin and recited in Latin. But you didn't have to be rich. Even the poor scraped together pennies for this spiritual service. Some joined confraternities, lay brotherhoods that pledged mutual prayer support. Pray for me when I die, and I'll pray for you when you do. It was theological teamwork with candles and chants. These prayers weren't vague. They followed strict liturgies and in some regions even came with receipts. One surviving English record reads, "One soul mass, read for Thomas the Miller, payment 2d." The monk likely said, "That mass at dawn, eyes half closed, murmuring Thomas's name between psalms." Of course there were debates. Some theologians argued that prayers should be offered freely, not bought like flour or wool. Others insisted that hiring monks was a noble act supporting the church while easing a soul's suffering. Unsurprisingly, the church mostly sided with the latter. There's a particularly quirky case from 13th century Spain where a man left half his estate to fund a daily mass for his donkey. The clergy protested animals didn't have souls, but the man's family insisted. After several confused discussions, the funds were redirected to his own soul under protest. Sometimes the prayers went beyond the church. In a few regions, children were paid to walk graveyards reciting Our Fathers for unknown souls. These were called solars, and they carried bags of crumbs or apples for sustenance. One little girl in Brabant reportedly prayed for 25 souls in one afternoon, then got a stomach ache from too many pears. Modern historians continue to debate whether these practices were sincere spiritual acts or institutional fundraising. Some argue both can be true. After all, in a world of uncertainty, wouldn't you want every possible edge? So while your body lies silent, your name might still echo through stone halls whispered by a monk with tired hands. A candle flickers beside your record. The ink dries slowly. Your afterlife, like your life, depends on others remembering and paying. Beneath the folds of your shroud, someone tucks the final detail, a piece of clothing perhaps. Not for warmth, not for modesty, but because even the dead needed to be dressed, and what they wore mattered more than you might think. Burial garments in medieval Europe were as symbolic as they were practical. In most villages, the dead were wrapped in a plain linen shift, simple white and untailored. It was called the winding sheet, and it resembled a nightgown more than a tunic. Some called it a sleeping dress because that's what death looked like to them, a long, strange sleep. But the choice of clothing wasn't always so simple. In wealthier homes, the deceased might be buried in their best robes trimmed with embroidery or fur. Sometimes they wore crosses stitched into the fabric. Occasionally, a widow's veil or a knight's tabard was included, symbols of life woven into death. And then there's the strange economy that grew around these garments. Wool was taxed, but linen was not. So laws were passed mandating that all corpses be buried in wool to support the English textile industry. A bit macabre, yes, but patriotic. Inspectors were even appointed to check grave clothes, and families could be fined for slipping linen past the gate. That led to burial theft. Yes, you read that right. In lean times, gravediggers or desperate villagers would exhume fresh corpses just to strip them of garments, jewelry, or even decent boots. One case from 14th century York details a woman arrested for removing a dead man's shirt and trading it for onions. Practical, maybe. Legal, absolutely not. Churches condemned the practice, but often looked the other way. Clothing was valuable after all, and dead men rarely complained. One priest was even caught recycling burial shifts among several funerals, laundering them quietly between ceremonies. He claimed it was for the good of the parish. The bishop disagreed. In some places, burial clothes reflected profession. Bakers were buried with flour-dusted aprons. Shepherds wore homespun cloaks. A midwife in Flanders was dressed in the same smock she'd delivered children in for decades. It was a quiet kind of honor, wearing your life's work to your final rest. Children were usually wrapped more tenderly sometimes, in christening robes. One mother stitched a lullaby into the hem of her daughter's gown. The thread was blue. The song no longer remembered. But the garment was found centuries later, folded inside a lidded coffin, the words barely legible. Historians continue to sift through burial records and remnants, trying to piece together these choices. Were they about faith, identity, thrift? Likely a little of each. In a world without photographs, the final outfit became the last visible statement of who someone had been. And so, your burial shift clings to you now, coarse or soft, plain or borrowed. Perhaps it carries a stain, or a patch, or a scent only one person would recognize. And as the soil presses gently down, it becomes part of the earth's memory, two-fiber thread and farewell. Out near the thorn bushes beyond the consecrated ground lie the graves no one blesses. They're unmarked, often shallow, and separated by distance more than design. This is where the unwanted are buried, souls considered too unruly, too stained, or simply too inconvenient for the central plot. You mercifully were not placed here, but others were. Suicides, for example, were often denied burial in churchyards. Their deaths were seen as sins, final acts of despair that defied divine order. Many were buried at crossroads where the traffic of the living would metaphorically stamp down the spirit. A few were even buried face down to prevent rising. Criminals, too, were frequently interred beyond the wall. Their bodies, once displayed on gallows or wheels, were eventually cut down and placed in earth that held no prayers. If a family had means or persuasive charm, they might bribe a sexton for a closer grave. Otherwise, the edges waited. And then there were the infants. Unbaptized babies were a painful theological dilemma. The church taught that without baptism, a soul could not enter heaven. Parents caught between grief and doctrine sometimes buried them in secret under hedges inside tree roots or even within the foundations of their homes. In Ireland, these were called Silene children's burial grounds, quiet places filled with heartbreak. Folklore blossomed in these margins. It was said that if you walked too close to the edge at night, you might hear whispering. Not words exactly, just the low hum of spirits unsettled. In some regions, people left pebbles or broken pots as markers not out of respect, but to warn others something lies beneath. There's a recorded case from 15th century Bohemia where a traveler stumbled across such a graveyard at dawn. He claimed he saw small lights flickering above the earth like candles without flames. Was it swamp gas imagination or simply the weight of sorrow taking visible form? Historians raise eyebrows. Villagers nod solemnly. In a few defiant cases, families built their own rituals. A mother might place a lock of her child's hair in the family grave, so at least part of them lay in holy ground. Others carved discreet symbols into fence posts, a shoe, a bird, a backward S codes only the grieving understood. Laws evolved slowly. By the late medieval period, some clergy began to allow masses for suicides or the excommunicated, but the stigma endured. Even today, archaeologists find these edge burials, bodies curled awkwardly turned away from the main rows, sometimes missing the usual grave goods or orientation. And yet even these forgotten plots hold care. Wildflowers grow here undisturbed. Moss softens the stone. And sometimes someone leaves a coin, a ribbon, or a bit of lace gestures that say quietly, "You mattered even if the records didn't agree." So, while you rest among the orderly graves, spare a thought for the restless edge. It too tells a story. Not of saints or sermons, but of grief rules and the quiet rebellion of memory. A dull scrape of metal. A muffled curse. Someone's digging again. But not for you. They're working near your grave, and oddly they're not avoiding the bones beneath. They're collecting them. This is not a desecration. It's just routine. Welcome to the era of grave reuse. In medieval cemeteries, space was limited. Graves weren't always permanent. Unless you were wealthy or famous, your resting place might only be yours for a generation or less. After a few decades, the body decayed. The grave marker vanished and someone else was quietly laid on top, beside, or even within your former niche. Some bones were left in place. Others were carefully removed and stored in ossuaries' bone houses. These were stone crypts, vaulted rooms, or even old church basements where bones were stacked like firewood, skulls on one side, femurs on another. The goal wasn't disrespect. It was organization. Diggers knew how to tell ripe graves from recent ones. The soil smelled different. Wood splinters told time. If a shroud remnant still clung to bone, it was too soon. But if all that remained was chalky white, then it was considered clean and ready to be moved. One particularly odd detail bones were sometimes washed before being stacked. Not ceremonially, just with buckets of water to remove dirt. Some were even marked with chalk crosses before storage in case the dead forgot themselves and needed reminding they were still Christians. In charnel houses, special buildings just for bones arrangements could be quite artistic. Monks at some monasteries created decorative walls using femurs and skulls, patterns like checkerboards or rosettes. One chapel in Portugal features a phrase above its door: "We bones that are here await yours." A cheerful welcome in its way. Why not just expand the cemetery? Well towns were tight, walls constrained space, and soil, especially in crowded parishes, was already full of the past. So, reusing graves became a necessity. And the church, ever practical, sanctioned it so long as the bones were handled reverently. Of course, accidents happened. There are reports of diggers stumbling upon skeletons with still preserved shoes, or coffins with waxy remains that hadn't fully decomposed. In one French village, a child once unearthed a skull with hair still attached and took it home to show his grandmother. She fainted. The skull was returned. Some historians suggest this cycling of graves shaped local memory. Names were forgotten quickly, but the act of burial-reburial and shifting bones created a sense of continuity death as part of the landscape, not apart from it. Others argue it reveals a pragmatic acceptance the earth has limits, but eternity does not. So, while your grave may feel permanent, it isn't guaranteed. Someday your bones might rest in a neat stack beneath a chapel, or be tucked behind another corpse's shoulder. No offense taken. That's just how space worked. And in this world, even the dead knew how to share. A flickering candle, a bowl of water, and 3 silent figures seated near your body, eyes half-lidded waiting. They're not mourners, not exactly. They're watchers, assigned, invited, or compelled to keep vigil through the long hours between death and burial, to sit with you just in case you moved. Vigil-keeping was a widespread tradition in medieval Europe, and it carried both spiritual and superstitious weight. The practice had roots in early Christian customs of praying beside the dead, offering psalms or chants to comfort the soul. But over time, something else crept in fear, because sometimes the dead didn't stay still. Families feared premature burial, demonic interference, or even the return of the recently departed. Watching the body ensured that if you stirred, twitched, or, heaven forbid, sat up, someone would be there to notice. Not to stop you necessarily, but to witness, to confirm, to sound the alarm. Vigils varied in tone. In some households they were solemn affairs, filled with whispered prayers and long silences. In others, they resembled quiet gatherings, mourners sipping ale, sharing memories, telling stories by firelight. Food was often present. So were herbs, sprigs of rosemary on the table, or thyme tucked behind the ear to ward off malevolent spirits. And yes, sometimes the body twitched. It was common enough to have its own vocabulary. The shuddering farewell, some called it. Others blamed it on trapped air or soul residue, knees bending, fingers curling. One German midwife once claimed to have seen a corpse exhale mist at midnight. Scholars today attribute these phenomena to rigor mortis and natural gas expulsion. But that's cold comfort to someone seated 2 feet away with only candlelight for company. To guard against unwanted movement or worse, wandering, some vigil keepers placed small weights on the limbs. Nothing heavy, just enough to feel resistance if the body tried to rise. Others drew chalk circles around the bed or sprinkled salt near the door, just in case your soul was tempted to slip out the wrong way. In a few superstitious regions, it was believed that leaving the body alone even briefly opened the door to possession. A wandering spirit, malicious or simply lost, might slip in, take up residence, and confuse the funeral entirely. One folktale from Brittany tells of a man buried with someone else's soul inside, who later haunted the village until his coffin was exhumed and turned sideways. Not all watchers stayed the whole night. Some took shifts, others dozed beside the hearth, one eye open. A few churches offered formal death watchers trained to stay calm in case of post-mortem surprises. They carried bells or whistles, not for ceremony, but to call help if the dead didn't behave. And so, in your final hours above ground, you are not alone. Someone sits beside you reading, dozing, or simply watching. Your hands remain still. Your chest doesn't rise, but the candle flickers slightly. And just for a moment, the watcher wonders, did your eye just twitch? Stone steps lead downward, cool and echoing. The torchlight flickers off lime-coated walls. Here beneath the chapel, or tucked behind the cloister, lies the ossuary, your final stop if space above proved tight. Inside it is silent, but not empty. The walls are lined with bones. Ossuaries were the answer to overcrowded graves, a way to respect the dead without endless land. When cemeteries ran out of space, bones from older burials were exhumed, cleaned, and relocated here. No longer buried, but stacked skulls on one shelf, femurs in rows, ribs like faded fans. A silent archive of former lives. If your grave were reused and your bones deemed clean by local custom, you might be carried here in a cloth sack gently shaken into a pile. The caretaker might hum a hymn or simply work in silence. He's done this before, countless times. He knows how to balance a jawbone so it doesn't roll. The arrangement varied by region. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, bones were sorted by type stacked geometrically. In France and Italy, skulls were often grouped into niches with names or initials scratched faintly above. And in places like the Czech Republic, artistry took over. Chandeliers of vertebrae, pyramids of tibias. Morbid, yes, but not intended to shock. It was remembrance by design. You might be surprised to learn these spaces weren't hidden. Villagers visited them, sometimes to pray, sometimes to marvel, and sometimes just to remember that they too would end here. A child might place a daisy on a skull and giggle. An old man might trace a finger along a femur, whispering an old friend's name. There's a curious record from a Czech ossuary where a local girl claimed she heard the bones whispering prayers at night. It was likely wind or dreams, but the story caught on. Locals started leaving candles near the doorway to keep the bones warm, they said. And yet, even here debates linger. Some clergy believed bones belonged in the earth undisturbed. Others argued that ossuaries were holy spaces, visual sermons on mortality. Memento mori, they whispered, remember you must die, but not with fear, with humility. Your bones now stripped of flesh and memory rest among thousands. No marker, no inscription, just a hollow eye socket gazing eternally at another. And perhaps that's fitting. After all the rituals, prayers, and bells you end, as all do, bone beside bone, dust among dust. But someone will still light a candle. Someone might still nod, pause and murmur a name they're not quite sure belongs to you. And in that small flickering moment, you are remembered. But even in death, memory wasn't always enough. Beneath those stacks of silent skulls lay another mystery. How long did your soul linger waiting for its turn? The bones stayed still, but the math behind salvation kept moving. You're floating not quite dead, but definitely not alive. The air smells like old incense and vellum. Monks whisper in Latin nearby, seated around a long wooden table, heads bowed over scrolls. You inch closer and see what they're doing, adding up sins. Pride, gluttony, sloth, each has a numeric value. It's like a medieval DMV, but the wait time is eternity, and the penalties are metaphysical. In monasteries across Europe, certain monks took on the peculiar role of purgatory consultants. They weren't officially called that, of course, but their job was to determine the spiritual debt owed by a soul before it could enter heaven. Was that unconfessed envy worth 7 days or 70 years? Their methods were a heady mix of theology, folklore, and good old-fashioned clerical speculation. Some monasteries even kept ledgers tracking patterns of sin in local villages, cross-referencing them with prayers performed, alms given, and deaths recorded. It was, in essence, a soul risk index. According to some records, a particularly pious person could shave years off their purgatory stay with the right donations made in their name. A small sack of grain to the local abbey, maybe a week less. A larger endowment, or a paid mass, that's decades off. Like a divine version of airline miles, but instead of upgrades, you get less time in spiritual limbo. And yes, there were cases of medieval disputes. One family might argue their uncle deserved a shorter stint because he'd quietly funded a chapel, Another might try to negotiate extra prayers for their ancestor who inconveniently had skipped confession the day before falling off his horse. There is no scholarly consensus on how much of this was genuinely believed versus performed out of ritual obligation. Some researchers suggest that these practices were more psychological comfort than doctrinal necessity. Others argue the church actively encouraged them as part of its broader spiritual economy, one that ran not on coin alone, but also on guilt, legacy, and hope. One especially bizarre record tells of a monk in 14th century Ghent who claimed to have devised a precise arithmetic formula: 7 years of purgatory for each mortal sin, 1 year. For each venial slip-up halved if the person had donated a cow to the abbey before death. Imagine explaining that to St. Peter, and yet, despite the absurdity, there's something oddly tender about it all. A community gathered not just to bury their dead, but to help them navigate the invisible toll booths of the afterlife. A spiritual layover booked and upgraded by candlelight. The candles burn lower now. A parchment crackles in the draft. And somewhere nearby, a brush dips once, then twice into a pot of crushed lapis. In the margin of a manuscript, a tiny man with wings stands frozen on the scales of judgment, 1 foot heavier than the other. You step closer. The soul weighing has begun. You're inside a scriptorium, the quiet heartbeat of medieval belief. And the illustrations? They're not just pretty. They are theology with teeth, delicate, deliberate, and often absurd. Artists known as illuminators turned abstract dogma into tangible scenes like courtroom dramas for the afterlife. And in these colorful corners, they captured one of the strangest fantasies of all souls being weighed like grain. The image was everywhere: frescoes, tapestries, prayer books. It usually looks something like this: a scale at the center, an angel on one side, a demon on the other, and a naked soul dangling awkwardly in the middle, arms outstretched in eternal embarrassment. Sometimes the demon cheats, pressing a claw down on the scale. Sometimes the angel frowns at the injustice, but justice isn't always the point. Some scholars remain puzzled by the consistency of this imagery across regions. England, France, the Holy Roman Empire. They all adopted the same visual shorthand, even when their theological views differed. Was it copied from older Egyptian iconography, like that of Anubis and the feather of Maat possibly? Or did medieval minds independently arrive at the same metaphysical metaphor, the soul as something weighty, almost physical, measured in balance? But here's the charmingly weird twist. Illuminators added quirks. In one manuscript, the soul is actually a pair of eyes with legs. In another, the demon is yanking on the scale's chain with his teeth. In yet another, a soul looks nervously at a nearby chicken, which may or may not be a metaphor for gluttony. These weren't just passive decorations. They were intimate spiritual cartoons offering comfort, fear, or laughter, depending on the reader. You imagine one such illuminator, perhaps in a Flemish priory, sitting hunched over his bench tongue, sticking slightly out as he adds gold leaf to a soul's halo. Did he believe in the afterlife he drew? Or was he just doing his job knowing his artwork would be flipped through by monks and mourners alike? One preserved scribal note in the margin of a manuscript reads, "I am so very cold." Another, simply, "This parchment is terrible." And yet these same hands sketch the liminal fate of every believer who had ever knelt in fear before death. Odd, isn't it, that something as universal as divine judgment was shaped by fingers numb from winter ink? Historians still argue whether these images shaped popular belief or reflected it. Did people imagine soul scales because of what they saw in books? Or did they ask for these images because they already feared the weighing? It's a chicken and egg question, or perhaps a chicken and soul one. Either way, next time you picture the afterlife, Remember somewhere a medieval artist gave your sins a silhouette and your redemption a shade of blue. It's late morning in a modest stone cottage. A quill scratches softly over parchment, pausing only to blot the ink. You're watching a letter take shape, only this one won't be delivered by hand or horse. It's addressed to heaven, and it's being written on behalf of someone who's already dead. In medieval Europe, the boundaries between life and death were more porous than you'd think. Families burdened by grief or guilt sometimes hired literate scribes to compose letters to the departed or to heavenly intercessors on the deceased's behalf. These weren't metaphors. They were actual letters folded, sealed, and buried with the body, or placed near an altar meant to communicate wishes, regrets, or spiritual requests. The practice emerged from a mix of folk belief and Christian doctrine. While official church teachings didn't endorse the literal mailing of messages to the afterlife, local traditions often filled in the emotional gaps. One record from 14th century France tells of a widow who had a scribe write to her husband begging him to forgive her debts and appear in her dreams with advice. Another story from Germany involves a child's letter to his dead mother, asking her to intercede with the Virgin Mary on his behalf. These letter writers were often monks or professional scribes, but sometimes even local schoolmasters took on the task. The tone varied. Some letters read like legal petitions, others like diary entries raw and dripping with sorrow, and occasionally the writer would include small tokens, bits of bread wax figures, or locks of hair tucked inside as spiritual postage. Some scholars continue to debate whether these letters were meant as true communications or symbolic acts of devotion. Were they prayers disguised as correspondence or emotional exorcisms crafted to soothe the living more than assist the dead? Whatever their purpose, the language is often heartbreakingly direct. One translated letter from a father to his son reads, "If you see the angels, tell them I miss you." Another ends simply, "Please wait for me." A particularly curious custom arose in parts of Poland and Bohemia, where entire towns would gather once a year to compose community letters to the deceased of the village. A single designated writer would read the names aloud, pause after each one, and then write a line based on what the mourners whispered. The result, long, meandering letters that sounded more like poems than prayers, filled with inside jokes, apologies, and hopes for shared dreams. There is no scholarly consensus on how widespread the practice was, or how it evolved. Some historians argue it faded with the rise of printed prayer books, which standardized mourning rituals. Others claim traces of it lingered well into the 17th century, especially in isolated rural communities. And yet, despite the debates, the idea persists, quiet, oddly modern. Because in a way these were the earliest forms of grief journaling, letters never sent, never meant to be answered, just something to say when silence felt unbearable. So next time you think of a loved one gone, imagine a candle-lit desk, a quill in motion, and a parchment marked, "To Heaven." A golden light filters through the stained glass of a forgotten chapel, casting long shadows across the pews. And there in the shimmering air, a peculiar scene plays out angelic customs officers at a celestial border crossing. Their wings are folded neatly behind them, quills poised over scrolls longer than a cathedral aisle. You're next in line. Medieval Christians loved order, especially when it came to the afterlife. And so, naturally, they imagined heaven as a kind of divine bureaucracy. In this vision, angels weren't just messengers with harps. They were toll keepers, border guards, and record clerks with immaculate penmanship. If salvation was a journey, then someone had to check your spiritual passport. This concept appears in dozens of illuminated texts and sermons from the 12th to 15th centuries. It was common to find depictions of angels standing at narrow bridges or staircases, demanding proof of purity before allowing passage. Sometimes they carried ledgers. Other times they negotiated directly with demons, bartering for a soul's release with prayers or past acts of mercy tallied like divine receipts. Researchers continue to debate whether these ideas stemmed more from apocryphal visions or from the Church's need to reinforce moral behavior. The imagery wasn't just fantastical, it served as a reminder. You'd better get your paperwork in order, spiritually speaking. One particularly whimsical sermon from 13th century England describes heaven as having multiple entry gates, each staffed by a different kind of angel. One for scholars, one for widows, one for humble peasants, and even one for reformed tax collectors, though their process took a good while longer. Another account from Bohemia tells of the Archangel Michael himself, inspecting soul luggage, tossing out unrepented sins like smuggled fruit at a medieval airport. Oddly, the angelic clerks weren't always incorruptible. A few folk tales describe angels who could be moved by a particularly good deed done on earth, helping a beggar, adopting an orphan, building a church bench with your own hands. These weren't bribes exactly, but they came close. One bizarre but delightful illustration from a German psalter shows an angel peeking into a basket labeled deeds, frowning at what appears to be a single moldy apple inside. The implication: someone didn't live up to their heavenly paperwork. And of course, all this mirrored earthly institutions. Medieval Europe was filled with toll stations, gatekeepers, and scribes. Crossing into a city, or even a different parish, often meant fees inspections and declarations. It's no wonder people envisioned heaven working the same way, only with a bit more gold leaf and a lot more judgment. Some scholars find this blending of divine and administrative oddly comforting. Heaven wasn't unreachable or unknowable, it just needed the right stamps. And perhaps that made it feel closer, more familiar, especially to commoners who lived under the constant watch of earthly officials. So, as you wait your turn in this celestial queue, take comfort. Your file is being reviewed by a feathered bureaucrat with all eternity to read between the lines. The scent hits you first, yeasty warm and faintly spiced. Then the chatter, soft and low, punctuated by clinks of cups and laughter that's more nervous than merry. You step into the courtyard of a medieval home where the funeral feast is well underway. Platters of bread, jugs of ale, and stews thick with root vegetables circle the crowd like silent participants in the mourning. Medieval people grieved with their stomachs as much as their hearts. After a death, it was common expected even to host a gathering with food and drink. And like all necessities in life and death, this custom soon gave rise to a cottage industry. Bakers, brewers, and cooks began specializing in the post-burial provisions. You didn't just bury Uncle Ethelred, you catered his after-party. This wasn't just indulgence. Theologically feeding mourners served a spiritual function. The meal honored the dead and symbolized hope for the soul's passage. Some traditions even held that the food shared helped transfer grace or goodwill to the departed. A crust of bread for your neighbor was in theory a step closer to heaven for your cousin. In bustling towns like York or Ghent, bakers kept ledgers for funeral orders. Black bread dyed with soot was popular, a visual nod to grief. Honey cakes in the shape of skulls or crosses were also common, sometimes wrapped in linen and given to children as keepsakes. In rural France, brewers offered morn ale, a lightly spiced low-alcohol beer, specifically crafted for funeral feasts. The name itself sounded like a melancholic pun, and perhaps that was the point. But not everyone could afford a feast. So enter the providers for hire itinerant cooks and brewing widows who offered package deals. For a modest fee, they'd bring enough food to feed a village. Some even carried sets of wooden trenchers and cups reused across multiple ceremonies. Like medieval Tupperware, only blessed. There is no scholarly consensus on how standardized these services became, but records suggest that certain providers developed reputations across parishes. A woman in Devon known only as Old Aggie was hired for over 40 funerals in 1 year. Another cook, Etienne the Ladle, was known for his cinnamon porridge, reportedly both comforting and aggressively binding. Quirky as it sounds, the practice had economic and social value. Funeral feasts provided work for local tradespeople, offered food to those who might otherwise go hungry, and let communities gather in ways that blurred the line between sacred and profane. Laughter wasn't taboo. In fact, it was expected death was already solemn enough. And yes, there were hiccups. One document from a 15th century church court mentions a brawl that broke out over who got the last goose leg at a funeral. Another notes a baker being fined for using wheat flour, meant for sacramental bread in his funeral pies. Sin by substitution, if you will. Still, it's comforting to think that grief could be softened by spiced sorrow, soaked in ale, and remembrance served warm. Not all farewells are whispered. Some come with seconds. The candles are guttering now, leaving trails of smoke that twist toward the rafters. You drift into a small stone chapel, tucked behind a grand cathedral. It's quiet except for the low murmur of Latin prayers, and they never stop. Morning to dusk, dusk to dawn. One priest, one soul, forever. These were the chantry priests men hired to pray endlessly for the salvation of a single deceased person's soul. In theory, the prayers shaved years off purgatory. In practice, it meant entire careers built around muttering the same names, the same liturgies over and over for decades. The system worked like this. A wealthy patron or grieving family would endow a chantry, a special fund or chapel space, and the church would assign a priest to maintain a dedicated prayer routine. Unlike the average parish priest, a chantry priest wasn't there to tend the living. He was a private spiritual servant to the dead. Imagine being contractually obligated to remember someone you never met for life. Historians still debate the sincerity of these arrangements. Some argue the priests truly believed in their duty. Others point out that, unsurprisingly, not every cleric maintained perfect attendance at the altar. In larger cities like London or Cologne, spot inspections of chantry chapels often revealed priests skipping services or slurring through the office of the dead after a night of too much morn ale. And yet, the position had prestige. Many young clerics saw a chantry appointment as a cushy gig, guaranteed income housing, and minimal confrontation with villagers. A few took the job so seriously that they developed obsessive routines marking the number of candles burned, tracking their prayers in color-coded ledgers, or composing elaborate chants for their clients. One 14th century account tells of a priest in Bruges who wore a special cloak stitched with the name of the soul. He prayed for a kind of spiritual uniform. Another report mentions a priest who refused to speak to anyone outside prayer hours, lest he dilute the purity of his intercession. There's a certain sad tenderness to the whole setup. The idea that someone somewhere might be whispering your name 100 years after you've died, that grief could be outsourced, ritualized, made eternal. And if the prayers weren't entirely sincere, well, maybe intention mattered less than repetition. Over time, chantries became both spiritual institutions and real estate ventures. Wealthy patrons would build entire chapels, decorate them with heraldic stained glass, and leave behind records that read like property contracts. In perpetuity, prayers shall be said each Tuesday and Friday, save during Lent, for the soul of Lady Marian of Swinstead and her dog Jasper. Eventually, with the Reformation, many of these institutions were dissolved. The theology shifted. The afterlife became less negotiable. But for centuries, chantry priests stood as quiet sentinels of remembrance. They were professional mourners, hired memory keepers' voices in the silence after bells stopped ringing. So, if you ever worry about being forgotten, picture a tired man in a cold chapel muttering your name into the dusk, again and again and again. The alley smells of smoke-damp wool and something fried that probably shouldn't be. You turn the corner and see them ragged figures with outstretched hands not begging for themselves, but for someone else. They hold wooden bowls, small tokens, and slips of parchment. Today they're not just poor, they're purgatory proxies. In late medieval Europe, it became increasingly common to hire the poor to receive alms on behalf of the dead. The logic was simple: giving to the poor was virtuous. But what if the person needing redemption was already 6 feet under? No problem, someone else could do the receiving. Thus emerged the odd job of the almsgiver for hire. The practice had roots in Christian charity and the belief that acts of mercy could help expedite a soul's journey through purgatory. But like many religious traditions, it quickly developed a transactional flavor. A wealthy family might hire dozens of poor individuals to stand outside a funeral or memorial service, each accepting a coin, a loaf of bread, or a token garment, then instructed to pray for the deceased in return. This wasn't merely symbolic. Contracts were sometimes drawn up to specify how many alms should be given how often and under what conditions. In parts of Spain and Italy, some families even issued alms slips, little notes explaining who the gift was for and which soul to pray for after receipt. Imagine a homeless man clutching a coin and a note reading, "For the soul of Bartholomew, departed this Tuesday last." Some scholars argue the practice provided real relief to the poor while reinforcing spiritual hierarchy. Others see it as medieval outsourcing a way for the wealthy to cleanse a soul without lifting a finger. Either way, it blurred the lines between genuine charity and posthumous performance. Quirky variations emerged. In rural Hungary, alms were sometimes given in exchange for standing vigil over a grave, even if the mourner had never met the deceased. In certain parts of Ireland, it became tradition to offer food to the poor in the name of a soul for 7 days after burial. The recipients would repeat the name aloud, each time turning the meal into a spoken prayer. There's a curious record from a parish in Normandy of one beggar who made a full-time living attending funerals across the region. He traveled with a cloak stitched with names, and when questioned by a priest about his odd garb, replied simply, "I wear my prayers," and not all of it went smoothly. A complaint filed in Cologne accused a group of boys of impersonating alms recipients, collecting coins, and promptly spending them on dice games behind the monastery. The church, understandably, was less than amused. Still, there's something strangely beautiful in the idea that mercy could be passed hand to hand, coin to hand, and prayer to soul. A chain of generosity stretching from the living to the dead, all mediated by those who had nothing except the time to remember someone else. The scribe coughs quietly and dips his quill. Behind him, rows of shelves bow under the weight of vellum-bound books, each one stamped with the ultimate finality, a human death. You run your fingers across the spine of a volume labeled De Obitu, the Book of Departures. Inside, it's less of a farewell and more of a scorecard. In the later Middle Ages, the job of recording deaths became surprisingly formalized. Certain clerics or monastic scribes were tasked with logging not just names and dates, but causes of death, social rank, moral standing, and sometimes a personal comment or two. These weren't just death records, they were moral footnotes for the afterlife. One entry might read, "Brother Anselm died of winter fever, generous with ale, poor at keeping silence." Another, "Agnes of Flanders fell from ladder, while hanging onions never missed a mass." These details gave texture to what would otherwise be a cold list of names. And they helped communities remember not just that someone died, but how they lived, failed, and tried. Some scholars remain puzzled by how widespread this practice became. While larger abbeys and cathedral towns had designated death registrars, smaller parishes often relied on whoever could write legibly and had spare parchment. In one case from northern Italy, a cobbler served as unofficial recorder for 3 villages noting deaths alongside his shoe orders. These logs served both sacred and practical purposes. On one hand, they allowed the church to track prayers, owed anniversaries to be honored, and masses to be said. On the other, they functioned as eerie administrative documents, evidence that even death required paperwork. But not all entries were dry. Some carried deep, strange humanity. A monk in Yorkshire recorded that a man named Gerard had died laughing at his own joke. Another noted that a widow passed away during a sermon on charity, which she found boring. Some scribes became known for their flair. In Bohemia, one priest decorated his death book with tiny ink sketches, tiny skulls, with various expressions depending on the nature of death. A smiling skull for those who passed peacefully, a weeping one for plagues, and a scowling face for those who had confessed late. A macabre emoji system centuries ahead of its time. And then there were the debates. Should moral commentary be included? Could a scribe really know the inner state of a soul? There is no scholarly consensus on whether these records were meant as final judgments or just community storytelling. Perhaps they were both. Occasionally an entry would include a request, pray for him, for he often fed the poor, or a confession written in another hand, I took what wasn't mine, but I feared hunger more than hell. Such lines make the parchment feel warm, almost pulsing, death rendered in ink and doubt. So next time you imagine the medieval afterlife, don't just picture saints and sinners. Think of the man behind the desk cataloging souls one line at a time, equal parts secretary storyteller and accidental theologian. You step through a low door into a candle-lit room, thick with incense and stranger things. A woman with silver-threaded hair looks up from a bowl of water, where shadows ripple though nothing has moved. Across from her, a man gently strokes a book, bound in cracked leather, murmuring names into its spine. You're in the presence of mystics, and they insist the soul is never truly silent. In the strange corners of medieval spirituality, some figures claim to see, hear, or even guide souls on their posthumous journey. These were the mystics and soul trackers, half shunned, half sought after, never quite trusted, but often consulted when traditional religion felt too quiet. They existed on the fringe of official doctrine. Some were devout nuns or hermits with visions praised by church authorities. Others were local wise folk with no credentials but plenty of clients. One popular example was Hildegard of Bingen, whose visions were eventually canonized, but countless other soul trackers were never named, just whispered about in alleys or back pews. Their specialties varied. Some claimed to see soul trails in candle smoke. Others said they could hear the last confessions of the dead if they held a handkerchief from the corpse. One tale from Saxony tells of a blind mystic who could smell unconfessed sins and offer directions, literal directions for how the soul might be guided to peace. Historians still debate how much of this was performance sincere belief or misunderstood mental illness. The church walked a fine line, officially condemning many of these practices as superstition, while simultaneously borrowing their motifs in sermons and visual art. A classic case of do not believe in this unless it helps your faith. There's an account from 15th century Krakow about a woman known only as Margola, who claimed she could escort restless spirits through the Valley of Fire if given 7 coins and a black hen. She had no church endorsement, but no shortage of customers. When a local priest tried to denounce her, half his congregation stopped attending Mass until he apologized. And then there were the dream guides. These mystics encouraged the living to sleep with sacred relics or images under their pillows to receive visits from dead relatives. If you dreamed of a loved one smiling, it was a good sign. If they were silent or turned away, more prayers and probably a donation were needed. One Italian manuscript includes drawings of soul ladders, rickety-looking staircases that ascended through various celestial layers, each rung guarded by a different emotion, fear, regret, love, hunger. Mystics use these images in their work, helping the bereaved visualize where their departed might be and what emotional tolls remained unpaid. There is no scholarly consensus on whether these mystics truly altered the fate of souls, but for many grieving medieval minds, they offered what sermons could not specific answers to impossible questions. So, you linger in the doorway watching shadows bend and voices hum and wonder if your soul got lost on the road to peace. Wouldn't you want someone like this looking for it? The earth here smells of rosemary and wet clay. Under the spreading branches of a yew tree, a man kneels beside a fresh grave, not to pray but to plant. He tucks a sprig of wormwood near the headstone, murmurs something too low to catch, and reaches for a spade. You've found a graveyard gardener, but he's not tending the dead. He's gardening secrets. In many medieval cemeteries, the caretaker's job extended well beyond digging and maintaining graves. Some were herbalists, blending burial duties with botanical rituals that no priest ever approved nor quite condemned. These caretakers often planted specific herbs and flowers on or near graves, and not always for beautification. Rosemary for remembrance, rue for repentance, yarrow for safe passage. It sounds poetic now, but in their day these choices were deliberate, even functional. Some believed certain plants calmed restless souls. Others thought roots helped weigh the dead down, literally anchoring them to earth until judgment. One record from Wales mentions a cemetery where every grave had a sprig of lavender buried with the body meant to keep the devils from sniffing. In Sicily, parsley was common, believed to mask the scent of decay and mislead wandering spirits. Meanwhile, in parts of Eastern Europe, garlic wasn't just for cooking. It was planted around graves to ward off the recently undead, just in case. Some scholars argue these plantings were holdovers from pre-Christian burial practices quietly stitched into daily ritual. Others suggest they were a way for illiterate communities to create symbolic graveside language floral headstones that told stories without needing words. Either way, graveyard gardening was never just horticulture. It was a kind of spiritual landscaping. There's even evidence of seasonal rituals. In Germany, caretakers in certain regions replanted or refreshed herbs, each equinox, believing the shift in light affected the behavior of the souls below. One particularly odd tradition involved planting onions upside down on the graves of liars so that when they tried to rise, they could only grow deeper into the dirt. And then there are the burial kits. Some graveyard gardeners carried pouches of dried herbs they sprinkled into graves before covering them with earth. A blend of sage chamomile and fennel might be used for a child. For a soldier, nettles and tansy. One such kit survives in a museum in Prague, its contents labeled only in tiny Latin scrawl, ad pacem anime, for the peace of the soul. There is no scholarly consensus on how sanctioned these customs were. Clergy often looked the other way, focusing on liturgy while leaving the plants to the practical men with shovels. And perhaps that's fitting earthly rites for earthy people quietly maintaining the peace between worlds. So, if you ever wander through an old graveyard and see unexpected herbs blooming among the moss, don't pull them. Someone long ago planted that sorrow with care, not just for the beauty, but for the journey still unfolding underground. The bell tolls once, then again. A third time, soft slow, like the world exhaling. You glance up at the church tower, where a figure pulls the rope with practiced rhythm. It's not quite a call to worship, not exactly a farewell. This is something else, a mercy bell rung for the soul's release. In the medieval imagination, sin didn't just stain the soul, it clung. And some believed that sound, particularly the ringing of consecrated bells, could help shake those remnants loose. Thus emerged the strange but widespread practice of tolling bells at the moment of death, and sometimes long after, to assist souls stuck in spiritual limbo. Bell ringers of mercy, as they were sometimes called, held a liminal role part, sacred functionary part, neighborhood noisemaker. Their duty wasn't just to notify the village of a death, but to perform a kind of sonic exorcism. Every clang was believed to drive off demons hovering nearby, eager to snatch a soul at its weakest. Some scholars remain divided on whether this was more symbolic or superstitious. Church records from the 13th century include instructions for death knells, specifying that bells be rung 3 times for men, twice for women, and once for children. Though why this gendered math was chosen remains unclear. Others mention the soul bell rung during funeral processions to clear the way through both earthly streets and spiritual planes. The bells themselves were often baptized, yes, like humans, anointed with oil and named. One particularly famous bell in France was called Maria Vocata, She Who Calls, and was rung exclusively for those who died suddenly or without last rites. The idea was to lend them a kind of emergency absolution through sound. Bell ringing wasn't left to just anyone. In many parishes, it was an appointed role passed down through families. There's a delightful record from a monastery in Burgundy of a bell ringer named Etienne, who claimed he could feel sin lift through the vibrations of the rope. Another noted that a bell had cracked on a particularly sinful Thursday, a detail that surely gave parishioners pause. In parts of northern England, villagers would request extra tolls for stubborn or grumpy relatives, hoping the added noise might do what sermons couldn't. In one case, a woman left funds for her bell to be rung every year on the anniversary of her death, accompanied by bread and ale for whoever listened. The practice even crept into bedtime rituals. In some homes, small handbells were kept on nightstands, rung gently before sleep, as a miniature version of the death knell just in case. Better to go out with a soft clang than a whimper. There is no scholarly consensus on how seriously people took the bell's spiritual effect, but few doubted its power to mark a transition. Whether driving off demons or calling angels near the bell, offered an audible shape to grief and a rhythm to loss. So, the next time you hear a distant chime, don't just think of time. Somewhere in history, that sound meant a soul was slipping free. A merchant arrives just before dusk, his cloak dusted with road grime, and his satchel clinking faintly with something bone-like. He steps into the cathedral's side door, not to pray, but to trade. Inside, a priest inspects the parcel with practiced care. A knuckle here, a tooth there, maybe a feather said to be from a saint's pillow. You've stumbled into the curious world of relic brokers. In the medieval spiritual economy, relics were prized above gold. The bones of saints' fragments of the true cross tears of the Virgin Mary, all were believed to carry miraculous power, and not just for the living. These sacred objects were said to offer intercession, comfort, and even salvation for departed souls. But where demand goes, so too goes supply. And sometimes supply got a little creative. Relic brokers were the traveling salesmen of salvation, hawking spiritual goods from town to town. Some worked for monasteries and churches, others operated independently or clandestinely, while some relics were legitimate, or at least believed to be others, were manufactured with theatrical flair. One notorious example from Florence involved a man selling St. John's molars 4 at a time. Some scholars continue to debate whether the public truly believed in the authenticity of these relics, or whether the ritual around them mattered more than their provenance. After all, if kissing a chipped bone gave your loved one a shorter stint in purgatory, did it really matter whether it came from a saint or a sheep? The trade was remarkably well organized. Brokers often carried letters of authentication, some real, others forged with elaborate seals and Latin flourishes. A few had relic catalogs listing items like finger of Saint Margaret singed, or splinter of the cross, unverified but convincing. And prices fluctuated depending on the saint's popularity, the item's size, and whether the intended use was protection for the living or mercy for the dead. One curious detail: bones were sometimes ground into powder and mixed with wax or oil to make relic balm and ointment applied to the dying or to a grave to seal in the soul's grace. These concoctions were also sold by brokers, often with dramatic demonstrations involving flickering candles and exaggerated sniffing. Of course, this raised eyebrows even in its own time. Church authorities periodically cracked down on what they called relic fraud, issuing edicts and excommunications. But the practice never really stopped. Demand was too high, belief too potent, and regulation too slow. There's a tale from Brittany about a widow who traded her entire dowry for what she believed was a scrap of the Virgin's veil. When questioned, she simply replied, "If it saves my husband's soul, then it is worth more than bread or bed." And maybe that's the point. For the grieving, a relic wasn't just a thing, it was a promise, a touchable hope. Whether holy or huckstered, it let the living feel they were doing something for the dead. So, next time you see an old bone behind glass, imagine the dusty hands that carried it, the trembling hands that bought it, and the silent souls it was meant to help. The room is dim and smells faintly of wax and ash. A woman leans forward, fingers pressed to her temples, as a sleepy-eyed man recounts his dream. His uncle, long dead, appeared in a vineyard and asked for a pair of boots. The visionary nods, scribbles something on a scrap of parchment, and charges 3 coins. Welcome to the surreal profession of the visionary accountant. In an age where dreams were considered doorways to divine or diabolical truths, certain people developed a curious expertise interpreting visions of the dead. Often self-taught and sometimes vaguely clerical, these interpreters helped the bereaved make sense of strange nocturnal visitations. And they didn't work for free. The service typically went like this. A grieving person would describe a dream in which a dead relative appeared, made a request, or simply behaved oddly. The interpreter would listen solemnly, perhaps consult a book of visions or an illustrated manual of symbols, and offer a reading. Depending on the outcome, the living might be told to light a candle, pay for a mass, go on a short pilgrimage, or, in rare cases, fulfill an oddly specific demand, like burying an item or repaying an old debt. Some scholars remain unsure how literal these services were. Were visionary accountants seen as actual intermediaries between worlds, or were they closer to grief counselors cloaked in mysticism? Surviving letters and records suggest a bit of both. One account from 15th century Bruges details a woman who dreamed of her husband asking for socks. The interpreter deduced this meant his grave was too cold, and the family proceeded to wrap it in wool. Practical, no. Comforting. Apparently, yes. The accountant title wasn't official. Of course, it's a modern nickname for a profession that blurred sacred and speculative. But some did keep records. Manuscripts have surfaced with columns labeled "Dreamer Deceased Image and Instruction Given." One such document includes entries like "Goat with 3 eyes, now eu fear of divine judgment, recommend 5 alms and a fasting week. Cousin appears in a blue cloak, desires confession on his behalf." These logs weren't just personal, they were often shared among interpreters, passed down as teaching tools, and over time certain symbols became almost standardized. A ladder meant ascent, a locked door meant unresolved guilt. Bread, oddly enough, often represented unsaid apologies. In parts of Germany and Bohemia, visionary accountants became semi-formal figures in parish life. People might consult them before hiring a chantry priest or donating to a relic fund. Their readings helped determine where money would be most effective, a spiritual cost-benefit analysis rendered in dreams. One particularly strange tale from Naples involves a man who claimed his father's ghost kept appearing with a weasel in his mouth. After several conflicting interpretations, it was decided the father needed a mass and that the weasel represented envy gnawing at the tongue. That solution cost 8 coins and included a commemorative candle. So, the next time you wake from a dream that lingers, ask yourself if you lived in the 1400s, who would you have paid to explain it? You're following a dusty road beneath a sweltering sun. A man ahead of you walks barefoot, his staff carved with tiny names. He stops to sip from a gourd, mutters a short prayer, and moves on. But this isn't his pilgrimage, it belongs to someone already buried. He's a paid traveler, a body in motion for a soul at rest. In the peculiar logic of the medieval spiritual marketplace, a journey could be outsourced. If the deceased had vowed to make a pilgrimage but died before fulfilling it, or if their family believed it might shorten their stay in purgatory, they could hire a substitute. These were known as surrogate pilgrims, and they took on the holy miles, the blistered feet, and the roadside prayers on behalf of the dead. The practice was surprisingly formal. Contracts were drawn up, payments exchanged, and expectations made clear. The surrogate might carry a letter or token from the family, often blessed by a local priest, to present at the destination shrine, and upon completion, they were expected to offer the prescribed prayers, touch the sacred relics, and sometimes even commission a candle or engraving in the name of the departed. Some scholars still argue about the ethical implications. Was a pilgrimage still spiritually valid if done by someone else? Did the soul receive the same grace? Opinions varied. The Church allowed it, sometimes grudgingly, on the grounds that intention mattered, and for many grieving families, it was better than doing nothing. Pilgrimage substitutes weren't necessarily poor or desperate. Some were seasoned walkers who made a profession of it. They knew the fastest roads to Compostela, the quietest hostels in Rome, the shortcuts to Canterbury. One particularly famous surrogate from Flanders reportedly completed over 20 pilgrimages, mostly for widows, who believed their husbands had a bit too much to answer for. Of course, the business had its shady corners. There are records of men who took the payment and never left town, or who visited the shrine but skipped the prayers entirely. One scandal in 15th century Paris involved a group of fake pilgrims who rented dusty cloaks and scuffed boots to make themselves look more convincing. Despite this, the emotional resonance remained powerful, for many knowing that someone was out there walking in the name of a loved one brought peace. It turned spiritual longing into something measurable, one foot in front of the other, prayers whispered at dawn, a blessing received under the shadow of a cathedral. Some even made it a family tradition. A grandmother might hire a pilgrim for her late husband, then request the same service for herself when her time came. Over time, the path itself became a kind of ghost story, traveled by the living for the sake of the dead. There's something oddly tender about it, the idea that devotion could be delegated, that love could take the form of tired feet and sunburned shoulders, a soul waiting in purgatory, and a stranger out on the road, carrying their name mile after mile. The ink has barely dried on the parchment. A seal is pressed hot, wax-quick thumb, sacred stamp. Across the top reads a phrase both solemn and strange for eternity. Below, the name of a soul, and further down, a promise of prayers, masses, and care. Welcome to the world of eternal tenancy, where the afterlife came with formal contracts. As the medieval church expanded its influence and wealth, so too did its administrative sophistication. By the 13th century, it became common for institutions, especially monasteries and cathedral chapters, to offer long-term spiritual services in exchange for material gifts. A noble might donate land or gold, and in return, the institution agreed to provide perpetual care for their soul. Not metaphorical care, real documented notarized care. These arrangements were called obits, or perpetual masses, and they were legally binding. One might ensure an annual service on the anniversary of a person's death. Another might establish a daily prayer. Some included instructions for lighting candles, ringing bells, or even feeding the poor in the name of the deceased, all spelled out in contracts, sometimes with witnesses, signatures, and dramatic flourishes, like "until the last trumpet sounds." Historians continue to debate how literally these promises were kept. In the short term, most were honored. In the long term, well, as generations passed and the list of obligations grew, some records were quietly lost, others deliberately ignored. By the late Middle Ages, it wasn't uncommon to find dusty ledgers full of names no one remembered, but still technically on file for daily prayer. The irony is subtle, but striking: eternity measured in ink and parchment. Institutions became landlords of the afterlife, accepting tenants with no intention of ever vacating. Some even built chapels or foundations named for their donors, housing both the monks who prayed and the very people they prayed for physically in crypts below. A peculiar document from a monastery in Burgundy includes a clause guaranteeing not just prayers, but clean linens for the altar on the soul's behalf, lest the Lord be greeted in rags. Another contract from Kent requests that the priest assigned to pray for Sir Godfrey not be drunk more than twice weekly. The clause is underlined. These arrangements sometimes extended beyond individuals. Families would secure generational contracts, ensuring that even great-great-grandchildren would receive spiritual upkeep. One Italian noblewoman negotiated an agreement for prayers to be said not just for her, but for any soul who shares my blood, known or unknown, to the 24th degree. That's a lot of candles. Over time, as reformers criticized the church's wealth and its blending of business with salvation, many of these practices faded. The Reformation rejected the notion of purchased grace, but for centuries the faithful believed they could pay not just for a better coffin or a finer grave, but for eternal attention. So, if you've ever wondered what immortality looked like in medieval Europe, it wasn't a fountain or a myth. It was paperwork, signed, sealed, and silently waiting in a drawer for Judgment Day. The air is still now. The bells have stopped, the ink has dried, and the last footsteps echo down the cloister hall. All the curious souls we met tonight, the monks tallying sins, the bell ringers warding off demons, the gardeners planting secrets, the dream interpreters parsing nocturnal nonsense, they have all faded gently into the quiet. And maybe that's what makes history so strangely comforting. Not its grand battles or famous names, but its odd, tender details, the jobs no one remembers performed in hope of easing someone else's eternal weight. Contracts for forgotten souls, letters never read. Footsteps walked for ghosts. It's all so unnecessary, and yet, someone did it anyway. So, if you're still awake, thank you for staying. Maybe tonight's stories helped quiet the day. If you'd like to return to tales like these, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it, and which forgotten medieval job would you secretly take?